out this evening. It's long been an interest of mine. I've written about it many times over the last several years. The idea that civil liberties and these basic freedoms are not really the provenance of any one particular ideological faction, that they really have trans-ideological appeal. And that part of the problem with protecting civil liberties has been that they've been confined to specific political parties or factions within political parties, or identified with the left or the right, and that sort of ghettoized these policies and made them weaker, and that what we really needed was an understanding that these liberties are really of equal interest and value to everyone, regardless of where one falls on the ideological spectrum. And so I'm really actually happy to be a part of an event, a tour that is premised on that principle. And that really brings it to life and animates it, because we're all here to talk about the value of civil liberties, notwithstanding the fact that we all fall in different places on the ideological spectrum. And so I'm really appreciative of the Young Americans for Liberty and the Future of Freedom Foundation and the other campus groups here who have helped to sponsor this event. I have spoken a lot in many different venues, at many different events over the last 4 or 5 years about the state of civil liberties. And civil liberties is a really complex issue, and there are a lot of different approaches one can take to discussing it. And what I used to do for the first couple of years of the Obama presidency, throughout 2009 and 2010, whenever I would stand up and speak about civil liberties, is I would devote myself to the argument that, notwithstanding the very central pledges that candidate Obama made during the presidential campaign, President Obama has in fact continued the vast bulk, in fact the heart and soul, the defining features of what just a few years ago in Democratic Party circles was known as the shredding of the Constitution, the BushCheney assault on civil liberties. And it used to be the case for the first couple of years that when I would stand up and make that argument, I would be obligated to devote the vast bulk of my time to systematically examining each one of the policies that has been embraced by President Obama and assembling a whole variety of pieces of evidence to prove how compelling this argument was, because even people who might be somewhat sympathetic to it, who are willing to be critical of the president or the Democratic Party, were nonetheless resistant to the idea that these awful, heinous, horrible policies that we heard so much about during the Bush years as being an assault on the Constitution were actually being continued and embraced, and in some cases accelerated, by the urbane, sophisticated, progressive constitutional law scholar. And it really took a lot of effort to demonstrate the truth of this premise, that there was continuity. And yet now, in the fourth year, going into the fourth year of the Obama presidency, it is completely unnecessary for me to stand up and engage in that exercise, because it has become so glaringly obvious, so incredibly self-evident, that this continuity exists, that virtually everybody across the political spectrum acknowledges it. You have people on the left and people who work on civil liberties who from the start were furious about it and were yelling about it. And you now have people on the right who instinctively want to attack a Democratic president as being weak on national security, actually doing the reverse, because even by the standards of our political discourse, standing up and pretending that President Obama is doing anything different than what George Bush and Dick Cheney did is even too dishonest for our standards. And so you have people on the right, like Dick Cheney and others, who are actually lavishly praising President Obama for continuing these policies and claiming success and vindication, saying, well, he obviously got into office, heard what we heard, and realized that these policies were necessary. So I don't need to go through all the examples. We heard a lot of them from Jack and Jacob just now about some of these policies that have continued. So instead I want to look at a couple of other issues that I think are extremely important when we talk about civil liberties that are a little bit less obvious than having me demonstrate to you what you probably already know, which is that there's been almost no daylight between the two administrations. The first issue I want to look at is what the effects are of this continuity between Bush and Obama, between Republicans and Democrats on these issues. And then the second issue that I want to examine is, why should we care about these issues? I mean, Jacob talked about the fact that these civil liberties are part of our heritage, that the founders enshrined them as our core principles, as what was supposed to animate the republic, and that's all entirely true, but I'm not really sure that's enough to care. I mean, the fact that the founders thought that certain things were important doesn't necessarily mean that those things are important in our lives. And so I think it's incumbent upon any of us who believe in civil liberties and want to persuade others that they're important to talk about why they matter, why we should care about them, because I don't think the answers are particularly obvious. So with regard to the first issue, which is what the effects are of this continuity, I just want to begin by sharing with you a little anecdote, a personal anecdote that is somewhat embarrassing. But I'm going to share it anyway because I'm just a very self-sacrificing person who believes in the cause that much, but I'm willing to even embarrass myself in order to advance it. But as I said, I used to go around in 2009, 2010 talking about the Obama presidency's assault on civil liberties. When I would go around in 2007 and 2008 to events and speak about civil liberties, what I would do instead was talk about the grave assault on these civil liberties from the Bush presidency. And I would talk about all the horrible things that George Bush was doing to the Constitution and to civil liberties in the name of terrorism, and the reason why it was so imperative to remove this faction from office that had been doing that. And each and every time that I would do that, just about, somebody would stand up in the question and answer session afterwards. And there was one particular incident that I remember quite vividly. I actually thought about it as I was preparing to do this event because it took place when I spoke at Jacob's organization in early 2008. I spoke to the Future Freedom Foundation at a conference there about civil liberties, and there was a gentleman who stood up, and he appeared to be nonpartisan or independent. It was probably a libertarian. And he said, look, I agree with you that George Bush and Dick Cheney have been awful on freedoms and civil liberties for all of the reasons that you said, but you seem to think that changing the party in control, that removing the Republicans from power is going to be some sort of solution. And isn't it true that even if there's a Democrat in office next year, beginning in 2009, that president will become convinced that these powers are good and that he can exercise them for the good, and that his followers, the Democrats and progressives, who are now denouncing these policies, are going to end up supporting them. And that was a variant of the question that I would get every time. And in response to that question, and all the people who asked that question, I was actually pretty dismissive. And I said, you know, I can't predict the future, and there's probably going to be a few really hardened hacks who will just defend whatever their political party does, even if a year and a half ago they were vehemently attacking that policy. But I think by and large, progressives and Democrats have become so invested in this framework of grievances about these civil liberties assaults. They've been so vocal in their denunciation of these policies that even if they're tempted by partisan self-interest, which they might be, to look the other way or to even cheer when their own president and their party adopts these policies, just sheer embarrassment will prevent them from doing that. Because if they end up endorsing these policies that they've spent the last 8 years so vocally screaming about as an attack on everything sacred, it's going to be so glaringly obvious that they are intellectually dishonest to the extreme, that they have not a shred or an iota of integrity, that even if that's true about them, they won't want themselves to be that revealed. And I think that will serve as a deterrent to their supporting and overlooking the continuation of these policies under the political party. And every now and then I indulge this fantasy that I can find out the names of the people who asked me that question and find out where they are and go to each of their homes and personally apologize for the answer that I gave. Because I don't think there's anything that I've ever said in all the time that I've been writing about politics that has ever been more wrong than that view, than my prediction about what would happen. Because what we've actually seen is the whole litany of Bush-Cheney policies that were once so controversial, from indefinite detention to the invocation of state secrets to shield presidents from judicial review to military commissions, and even lots of areas where President Obama has gone beyond the abuses of George Bush and Dick Cheney, from his unprecedented war on whistleblowers to prosecuting a war in Libya, not just without congressional authorization, but even once the Congress voted against its authorization, to targeting American citizens for execution by the CIA without due process and in total secrecy, without a shred of transparency. And we've seen, by and large, with a few exceptions, Democrats and progressives and liberals, the same faction that screamed about shredding the Constitution for all those years, either look the other way or worse, find ways to justify and defend it. And what is particularly amazing to me, just to highlight one example of just how extreme the dishonesty and hypocrisy is in this regard, is that if, it wasn't the case that civil liberties during the Bush year was some ancillary side issue for Democrats. It was really the central grievance against George Bush and Dick Cheney. The war in Iraq was certainly at the forefront, along with things like Guantanamo and torture and breaking the law and these Article II theories of executive power. These were central to the Democratic Party's grievances against George Bush, and they were central to the Obama campaign as well, the restoration of the rule of law and civil liberties. And if you look at what the primary scandals were during the Bush years in this regard, what the Democrats were angriest about, at least they purported, was that George Bush had asserted the power to eavesdrop on the conversations of American citizens without warrants of any kind, and had even asserted the power to detain and imprison American citizens without due process of any kind. These were extreme scandals that showed how extremist and radical the Republican Party had become in the age of the War on Terror. And yet now you have President Obama not only eavesdropping on Americans without due process or without warrants, and not only detaining or asserting the power to detain Americans without a trial or charges, you have the Democratic president asserting the power to kill American citizens without any due process, and not just asserting the power, but exercising the power, and the silence is basically deafening. In fact, when I write about these issues now, it used to be the case that in 2007, if I wrote about things like due process and search warrants and all these other radical doctrines, the people who would be the angriest about it, who would write in opposition, would be followers of George Bush, Republicans, people who were neocons and in that branch of conservatism. Now when I write about these issues, it's almost invariably Democrats who attack the arguments I make or who attack me for defending these positions. That's how much the ground has shifted. And the principal effect of what has happened is that what it has done is that it has taken these policies that up until 2008 were really the symbols of right-wing radicalism. They were extremely controversial, these policies. If you talked about indefinite detention in military commissions in Guantanamo, huge fights would break out in mainstream political venues between Democrats and Republicans over the propriety of these policies. What happens now is the exact opposite. These policies are no longer the provenance of radical Republicanism. They are now bipartisan consensus. They're the orthodoxy of the political class generally, because the both parties have now had a president fully embrace them. And therefore the supporters of those parties, the loyalists to those parties, have become identified with them and defend them reflexively. And what happens when a policy is transformed from the policy of one side that's controversial and that sparks anger and debate into bipartisan consensus is it gets removed from mainstream political debate. So you will no longer ever hear, for example, if you have the misfortune of turning on MSNBC, which you shouldn't do and you should avoid at all costs, but if by some reason you're somewhere and it happens to be on, or you accidentally turn it on and don't turn it off quickly enough, you will never ever hear any of these issues discussed that I just described, even though back in 2007 and 2008, they led the broadcast of virtually every single primetime MSNBC show, the idea that our Constitution was being trampled on, and that's because these policies no longer afford any opportunistic way to attack or harm the other party. They are bipartisan consensus. And there's actually some really interesting studies, including by a Yale law professor named Jack Balkin, about what happens when political policies become bipartisan consensus after once becoming controversial. What essentially happens is they are shielded from challenge, and they become entrenched for at least a generation, usually longer. And the two examples that he gives historically that illustrate this point are the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, which when it was ushered in was the leading political controversy. Republicans had dedicated themselves to uprooting the New Deal, and yet the first Republican president elected after FDR was Dwight Eisenhower, and he really didn't do much other than tinker on the margin with the New Deal programs. And as a result, it no longer was politically controversial. It simply became absorbed into the political landscape and became intrinsic to the American political culture. And the same thing happened with the Great Society reforms of Lyndon Johnson. The Goldwater Republicans and the American right were furious at the expansion of all these entitlement programs and government power and vowed to destroy them the minute they got into office. And yet the first Republican president elected after Lyndon Johnson was Richard Nixon, who did none of that. In fact, he actually expanded some of these programs and embraced the core premise. And this is what Barack Obama has done. is he has taken the core premise of the Bush-Cheney assault on civil liberties and the war on terror, which is the idea that because it's a war, the president is omnipotent and need not answer to anyone or any institution. That the president can arrest anyone, imprison anybody, or even kill anybody based solely on his unilateral, secret, unreviewed say-so, that the person is a terrorist, that his powers are limitless. The Democrats have now embraced that policy as their own, and therefore these policies have become strengthened and really protected from challenge in a way that the Republicans could never have dreamed on their own of doing. And that virtually ensures that at least in mainstream debate, meaning debates between people who are devoted to one party or the other, these ideas are no longer challenged. They're simply accepted and absorbed into the political culture, and that is a huge problem for those who believe that these policies are problematic and dangerous. So that's the principal effect of this continuity, and then that leads us to the question of why should we care? Why do we care about indefinite detention or the deprivation of due process or the sending of drones to assassinate whoever the president targets or the extreme amounts of secrecy behind which the government operates? And the reason why that's a difficult question to answer is because my guess is, and I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that this is true, that for the vast majority of people in this room, if not all of us, when we wake up in the morning and think about the acute, immediate problems that we face, the prospect that the government is going to come and take us and put us in Guantanamo for the next decade without a trial, or send a drone over our house and shoot a Hellfire missile that will kill us and our children and our other loved ones, is probably not very high on the list. And that's because by and large those policies are targeted at people who are Muslim, and usually who are devoutly Muslim, and who usually are critics, pretty strident critics in a public way of American policy. And so the question then becomes, why should people who aren't acutely threatened by these policies really care much about them? Why aren't the Democrats doing something justifiable by just simply sidelining these issues because they don't really care about them, because they don't think they're affected by them? And it's not an easy question to answer in a convincing way. I mean, there's one obvious way to try and convince people that they should care, which is when you vest a president that you like with a certain power, that president is going to leave office one day, one way or the other, and then there's going to be a president who you don't like very much and who's going to have that same power. So I know that during the Bush years, people who criticized Bush policies used to try and tell Republicans they too should care that the president is eavesdropping on conversations without warrants, because do you really want Hillary Clinton being able to sit in the Oval Office and decide to read your emails or listen in on telephone conversations without warrants? And if you endorse this power now, that's what's going to happen, and shouldn't you therefore object when a Republican president does it, even though you trust this particular president? And I know that I talk all the time to Democrats and say to them, do you really want Newt Gingrich or Sarah Palin or whoever the Democratic villain of the moment is, Michelle Bachmann, being able to sit in the Oval Office and pick out American citizens in secret and then order the CIA to go and kill them without charges or a trial? Are you comfortable with that framework? And that seems like an intuitively potent argument, because rational people should find that appealing, and yet that doesn't really work on people. They get that rationally, but it doesn't really move them, in part because people think about short-term political considerations. They want to win the next election. They don't want to stand up and object to their own party's policies, even if there's some long-term speculative danger that will come from it. And they also think they're immune. So that doesn't really work in terms of getting people to care. And so I think there's a few other ways to think about why we should care about these abuses, even for those of us who think that we're not immediately affected by them. And I just want to talk about a few different aspects of the why we should care question. And to do that, I just want to tell another quick anecdote. This one is not embarrassing, I don't think. I guess I'll leave that for you to judge. But before I did what I do now, which is writing about politics and talking about political issues and the like, I was a civil rights litigator and a constitutional law attorney. And I represented a lot of clients whose First Amendment free speech rights were being abridged. And like most people who do that kind of work, like the ACLU, who represented Nazis who wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois, where there were a bunch of Holocaust survivors, and they defended the rights of Nazis to do so, and lost a lot of supporters, Jewish donors and the like, who were offended by their position. I too, in a lot of First Amendment free speech cases, represented people with some extremely heinous viewpoints, white supremacists, avowed Nazis, really extremist, anti-immigrant bashers and the like, both literally and figuratively. And the question that I would get all the time, even from people who were sympathetic to the underlying free speech principles that I was defending was, well look, I support the work that you're doing in this area, I think you're right about the importance of free speech, but why do you need to defend these people who are just so grotesque and reprehensible, as opposed to defending somebody who just has more palatable views? And the reason why I would defend them, and the argument, the explanation that I would give is the same one that's given by all people who defend people with heinous views in a civil liberties context, which is when the government wants to abridge rights and wants to limit free speech liberties or other liberties, they don't pick people who are expressing views that are uncontroversial. They purposely seek out the most marginalized and despised elements in the society because they know that when they do that, if they abridge the rights of people who are most disliked, that they can get lots of other people to either be supportive of it or to be indifferent towards it. Well, I'm not somebody who's a Nazi, so I'm not going to worry if they're barred from having marches. I know that if I want to march, the government will let me. Or I find them so grotesque that I'm actually glad the government is putting them in prison for the things that they say because what they're saying is so heinous. And that is always the way that power factions know that they can erode liberty, is by picking out the most marginalized people in the society at first to institutionalize and legitimize these powers. And that's the reason why you find that civil liberties lawyers always represent those kinds of people, is because that's where these erosions occur. And that's what leads to, I think, a couple of interesting observations about why we should care about civil liberties abuses. Because the first point is that civil liberties abuses always take place in the initial instance in sympathetic ways that are sympathetic to most people, and yet they always expand beyond their original application. But the expansion to beyond the original application to people who may not be as reprehensible, or even to people who are closer to you, by that point, fighting against it is too late because you've allowed the powers to become legitimized. And you see this all the time. Powers that were seized by the government in the name of the drug war have been applied to virtually all criminal cases. The Patriot Act and other pieces of legislation that were justified in the name of terrorism have been applied to all sorts of domestic dissidents and other political activists. These powers inevitably expand beyond their original application, and if you sit by passively or even supportively in those original cases because they're being applied to people that you're comfortable seeing oppressed, inevitably those powers will get closer and closer to you, and by then it will be too late. The other issue, and I think this is actually a bit more compelling, although it's a little harder to express, is that the purpose of civil liberties is to protect exactly those views that majorities reject. If the founders were only cared about, or if we only cared about protecting views that the majority found palatable, you wouldn't need a free speech guarantee. You wouldn't need a restriction on the government restricting people's free speech rights, because people who express views that are palatable to majorities are never the ones whose free speech rights are being violated. It's people whose views are despised by the majority, or whose religion is despised by the majority, or whose political activism or other attributes make them alienated from the majority of people. Civil liberties are really about protecting minority rights, or about protecting the right to dissent from orthodoxies and political power. And again, if you think that you aren't someone who is a dissident or who wants to dissent from political orthodoxy, you can't be sure that that will be the case tomorrow, because what is a dissident changes with political prevailing mores. But more important than that is that the right to dissent, the right to challenge political orthodoxies and power, is an incredibly important attribute of any society. It's a check on society. It's the way that societies evolve. It's the way that errors get identified. And even if you're not somebody who wants yourself to dissent, the power to dissent among citizens is incredibly valuable for the society in which you live, and it's civil liberties that guarantee that. And allowing the erosion of civil liberties makes inevitable the loss of this important right, the right to challenge political orthodoxy, to to question those in power. It's really in that area of dissent where creativity and progress resides, and civil liberties are really designed to protect that sphere. But the last point I want to make about why we should care is really the one that I think is most important. And that's this. It's civil liberties, when you allow erosions and allow the government to step over the lines that the Constitution says that the government can never cross, what it does is it radically changes the relationship between the government and the citizenry. And this to me is a really important point, though it's difficult to convey. When you have certain lines that you don't allow the government to breach, then you don't fear the government, because you know that you can exercise these rights that are extremely important without repercussion. You can express views that are despised by virtually everybody without fear that you're going to be punished for them. And you can engage in political advocacy or challenge the government without fear that you're going to be put in prison without charges or have a drone sent over your house because you're going to be targeted for assassination. But once the government starts to cross those lines, a climate of fear arises in the citizenry that really alters the way the political culture functions. And this to me became most evident, or really evident for the first time, when I first wrote about the issue of Wikileaks. I was somebody who wrote over the last couple of years continuously in defense of Wikileaks and their right and the importance and value of what they were doing in terms of exposing government secrets and breaking down the wall of secrecy. But the first time I ever wrote about them was in January of 2010. And this was before really anybody knew what Wikileaks even was. It was before they had done any of their news-making leaks like the Apache helicopter video and the Iraq and Afghanistan war documents. It was before that ever happened. And the way that I had learned about Wikileaks was there was a report, a top-secret report, prepared by the Pentagon. And the Pentagon, in this top-secret report, declared Wikileaks to be an enemy of the state. That was the phrase that it used. And it talked about they plotted ways to try and destroy the efficacy of Wikileaks, to submit fraudulent documents to them so that they would publish it and have their credibility destroyed, or to uncover the identity of their sources to prevent people from being comfortable about submitting classified information to Wikileaks for them to publish. And ironically, this top secret report got leaked to Wikileaks, which then published it. And that was how I learned about it. I read this report. And there was actually an article in the New York Times, a very brief one, that talked about how the Pentagon considered this weird group that was devoted to transparency to be an enemy of the state. And although I didn't know very much about Wikileaks at that point, I pretty much assumed that any group that the Pentagon was declaring to be an enemy of the state and was plotting to destroy was one that deserved probably a lot of support. And so I looked a lot into what Wikileaks had done and found that they had done a lot of impressive things in terms of exposing government corruption and secrets in all kinds of parts of the world, government secrets and corporate secrets. And I interviewed Julian Assange about it, and I wrote a long article about Wikileaks and the promise that it had to subvert government secrecy. And at the end of this article, and I posted the interview with Julian, and I encouraged people to go and donate money to Wikileaks because they had budgetary constraints that were preventing them from processing what seemed to be important leaks that they were sitting on. And I provided a link to their bank account information and to their PayPal account and other means that people could use to donate money to Wikileaks. And in response to my writing that, I had huge numbers of people, I mean dozens, over 100 at least, in all different ways, in the comment section to my article, by email, at events like this, who would say things to me along the lines of, look, I really agree with what you're saying about Wikileaks. I understand the value that you see in them and the potential and promise that they have and the reasons why you're encouraging people to support them. But my concern is that if I donate money to Wikileaks electronically, if I wire money to them, or if I send them money through PayPal, that I'm going to end up on some government list somewhere. Or even be subjected to some kind of criminal liability if ultimately they get declared to be a terrorist organization and then I'm subjected to prosecution for materially supporting a terrorist group or some other warped legal theory that would suggest that I've done something wrong by giving them money. And so I'm actually afraid to do it. And these were not people prone to paranoia and conspiracy theories. These were, I could tell, well-rounded, well-reasoned people who were expressing this pretty intense fear. And the reason that fear was so striking to me was because Wikileaks was not a group, in fact Wikileaks is still not a group, that has ever been charged with, let alone convicted of, any crime of any kind. And in fact, WikiLeaks never could be convicted of any crime of any kind because what they do is just basic journalism. They receive secrets from people who have them and they then publish them. They report on what people in power are doing, which is the core of journalism. And yet here were all these people who were petrified of exercising their core First Amendment right, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It's core free speech and free association. These are people who are voluntarily ceding their own constitutional rights because of this climate of fear that had been created based upon their knowledge that the government can cross all these lines and does routinely cross all of these lines without any repercussions and without anyone stopping them or placing limits on them. That is what the climate of fear does, is it causes the citizenry to give up their own rights voluntarily and causes people to become passive and complacent out of fear. And you see this all the time. If you go into Muslim communities, they'll talk about their fear of challenging government policies or donating money to Muslim organizations that have a fear that they will be prosecuted for material support for terrorism. There are Muslim Americans sitting in prison for doing things that are extremely trivial in that regard who have been prosecuted and had long prison terms imposed on them. You see the same thing with the Occupy Wall Street movement. The excessive police force was about reinforcing this climate of fear that if you meaningfully disrupt us or challenge us in any way, there's nothing we can do to you, including pepper spraying you or mass arresting you for exercising your rights of free assembly. That is what the erosion of civil liberties first and foremost is designed to do, is it is designed to instill fear in the population that will intimidate them out of exercising their own rights. And so lots of people who think that they're free and are unaffected by these civil liberties erosions are in fact extremely affected by them in ways that they may not know. The socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg once said that people who don't move don't notice their chains. And so that's a lot of what the civil liberties erosions accomplish, is it makes people afraid to engage in real dissent because they don't want to engage in real dissent. They think that the government is not preventing them from doing anything and therefore they think they're free when they're not. And that's, I think, the most compelling reason to care about these erosions, even if people think they're not acutely affected by them. So the last point I just want to end with is to make this observation about the political faction with which I'm most associated, rightly or wrongly, and that is the sort of progressive faction that found George Bush's policies so highly objectionable. And what I find most disturbing and troublesome and even tragic about the acquiescence of this political faction to these erosions just because there's a Democrat in office is that all political factions have very positive attributes and negative attributes, positive attributes too. And the progressive movement in the United States, one of the positive attributes has been the tradition of defending the country from these kind of erosions. If you look at the policies that the left in America most vehemently condemned over the past, say, 60 years. There are things like the internment of Japanese Americans in internment camps, even though that was done by FDR, their own president. The left was vehement in their opposition. The McCarthy witch hunts, the unlawful and abusive spying of J. Edgar Hoover. All of these sorts of erosions that progressives in the United States were pretty vehemently opposed to. And if you look at their legislative successes, it's things like the Freedom of Information Act, that forces the government to disclose information about what they're doing, or the War Powers Resolution that says you cannot go to war or start wars without congressional approval, or the Church Committee and the FISA legislation that said that we've uncovered your surveillance abuses and you can no longer spy on us without warrants. These are the crown jewels of progressive legislative success over the last 50 years, and what all of this is based on, opposition to those abuses and this legislative success, is that we do not trust the government to exercise vast power in the dark and without checks because we know they will inevitably abuse it. And that has been an extremely important part of the progressive tradition, and yet it's basically been vaporized by the Obama presidency's assault on these values and the willingness of his supporters to acquiesce to them. And that's the reason why the solution to these abuses cannot really be found in activism within the two-party system or loyalty to either of the two parties. It can be found only by people willing to stand outside of this machinery and say that we're banding together regardless of ideological differences on other issues in order to demand that they stop. So with that, I thank you very much for listening, and we'll